James, you awake?" The berth was almost black, only the light from the slits in the inner wall sections permeated into the dank darkness, which was enough for her to see the dull shapes of the men in their hammocks. Cicely walked towards the back wall, where she knew James's was, and tried not to wake the snoring men she was passing on the way. Following the wedding, she had gone with Maturin back to his cabin, and he had explained that he had agreed with the captain that though she would take part in the battle, she would, for the sake of sensibilities, take up residence with him and carry out some work. Cicely had repressing the urge to argue about, and had asked permission from the doctor to at least change back into her sailing clothes. He had laughed before excusing his joviality, explaining she was at liberty to do what she pleased. However, this presumably did not extend to practicing maneuvers, as an hour later she heard the sound of the orders of war being called, the salts heaving cannon and irons, the officers and midshipmen directing. "James?" Cicely almost stumbled over Gordon, who for some reason had taken up sleeping on the floor, and lurched in the direction of her own hammock. Excellent, she thought, as she felt the rough Hessian fabric brush her arm, it was still up. In the same logical manner that he had proposed, Maturin had then explained what Cicely was to do with his work. She would transcribe the information from his notebooks made during observations on the Galapagos Islands, and Cicely had felt less inclined to mourn her exclusion from practice when she saw what delights she would be reading about, iterating his instructions obediently. However, this fascination only lasted 2 hours. Cicely had not imagined how long and laborious the job would be, especially still sitting there in the captain's wife's dress. The doctor had not taken the requested her permission to change as a cue to help her. It had been Blakeney, who had come along near supper time to bring her some food, who she had had to ask to unlace the incarceral ribbons tied so precisely by the captain so she could be free of the dress and have the chance to return to her own breeches and jerkin. "Rob?" She heard James's tired voice emanate from his hammock. "Give us a hand up, will you?" Cicely whispered, trying not to disturb the other men, and she felt James's hand on her shirt. It was not as if Maturin had not been kind enough to allow her his bunk. He had set up a hammock at the other end of his quarters that evening. He had asked her whether she had eaten supper, and when she had responded to the negative had explained gently that she was no prisoner, that she could dine with the men should she wish. His only request, he explained, was for her to sleep here for the sake of respectability, and ever the gentleman made a deal of remaining outside, allowing her to wash alone before bed. As she splashed cold water onto her face, Cicely considered, not for the first time, his goodness, and when he extinguished the candle half an hour later, Cicely lay in the darkness, examining why, after such kindness had been shown her, she felt troubled. "What are you doing here?" whispered the lad, as she climbed with his help into her old hammock. "The captain told us you'd be bunking with the doctor." He left the sentence unfinished, as if the reasons for her not being there were too complicated for him to put into words. "Can't sleep there," she replied quietly. "Not the same as here. Too enclosed." Cicely stopped and watched as the unspoken haze of division between them evaporated. "What did I miss?" As she spoke, Cicely realized what was concerning her. 2 well-meaning and honorable men were, through their duty to her honor, smothering and constraining her, controlling her. That was the life she'd left in Gloucester, the life she had fought to escape. Well, she'd be damned if she was going to be held to their rules now, not when she needed information that would help her on the morrow, and when she needed the security of her bear. But Cicely's mind began to doubt her bold impetuosity. "The captain's got a plan," said James sleepily. "You know the whalers we picked up from Chatham. We're to fool the Phantom that we're a whaler too, hide the colors and get close before attacking." Well, she'd return at the dawn bell. She could say she'd been to the head. As the thought rolled over in her mind, remorse chided her for her betrayal of his trust. "Once we get in close, Mr. Mowatt'll get the sheets high, then we fly the ensign." Cicely rolled over in her hammock so she could face James's direction and hear more clearly his description of maneuvers. The way Maturin had spoke to her, logically and reasonably, so full of honor and respect, mildly but reverentially. Had it not been a marriage proposal, she would have believed she was in the company of a learned man at a forum such as a debate or other. The gun crews will fire an 8 routine all in. That'll sort 'em, so says Lamb. Agreed Cicely absently. If the marriage were a contract of sorts, she must repay him for his kind commodious part of it by doing what he had asked regarding his books, even if she could not honor the promise she had made to sleep in his cabin tonight. He must never know her feelings and she must shun her affections for that reason. But that would be hard to do, she added, following the kiss Maturin had given her directly after Aubrey had pronounced them man and wife. The middies second, once over we're to feed the mainsail to an angle again to give Mr. Killick time, then the sheet can be lowered and returned to normal. James yawned. And not get distracted as she had done that afternoon. But it was curious why John Fotherington's name would be on a sheet of vellum at the back of the doctor's notebook, Albemarle, Volume 4, along with 7 others. She had studied the information for a moment, trying to see where it fitted in with Canis Aurore. Besides, Vicious, Marlet, Burgoyne. These sounded like French names, and since they didn't appear to be connected to botany or nature in any way, Cicely had replaced it between the pages from where it had fallen out. "Rob, you still awake?" James yawned again, and Cicely's mind was dragged from thoughts of the afternoon to the present. "Yes," she whispered. "I was just thinking, there was something I need to tell you. Do you remember when you were ill? In the sick berth?" "Not now, Rob, we need to sleep." Cicely stemmed the flow of conversation that had welled in her cerebellum. She would tell him tomorrow, sometime. Before the battle, at least. He must know about old Joe's supposition that he was his father, and his part in her being aboard the Surprise. "James?" "Yes, Rob? Do you think we'll get through tomorrow? I mean you and me?" Cicely heard the oak above them creak as James turned in his hammock. "We're under the best captain in all the service." "Yes, I know." Cicely sighed inwardly. "But assuming we don't, I just want to say dash." "You too, Rob," interrupted James quietly. "You're the best friend I've ever had, in all. Now shut up and get some sleep." 88,888,888. 4 bells tolled above the berth. Cicely opened her eyes and vaulted from her hammock quickly, almost landing on Chell. Without stopping to explain, she rushed through the men who had risen to begin their watch, and straight through the officers' mess, knowing that no one would be there at this hour. If she had had a chance to reflect, Cicely would have realized this had been the first night that she hadn't been awoken with the dreadful dream of her brother drowning. The dream of Edward floating face down in the ocean as the moonlight reflected off his hair. The one where Cicely finds herself going in to save him only to see his body, dead and stiff. 3 vital minutes of up and down decks it would save her, she knew as she opened the door at the far end which led onto the staircase. From the she hurried 2 at a time up to the first lower deck and turned right, down the corridor to where Stephen Maturin's cabin was. Slowing her pace now, Cicely walked towards the door, pushing down the latch carefully and quietly as she could. He would still be in his hammock now, as it was only 4:45. Cicely could slip back into bed and wait until he rose. She pushed open the door. Yes. Wait until he sat at his desk and she heard the scratching of his peacock feather quill. As she stepped forward, Dr. Maturin looked up from his writing, putting down the quill. Cicely stopped in her gait, and looked at him, his eyes looking between her and the page of transcription she had done the day before. She said foolishly, before closing her mouth. Whatever she was going to say would be ridiculous. Regardless of the reason for her being up, it was obvious she had not occupied the bed all night. Maturin nodded towards the ledger. Excellent, he said, nodding towards her handwriting, exactly what I was looking for. I don't think another man aboard this ship could have completed the work as accurately or quick. Said Cicely again, running over his last sentence in her mind. And you're exhausted from this, I expect. He continued, pushing his round-framed spectacles up his long nose, so much so that you slept well and got up early for a breath of fresh air? He snapped the book closed when he'd finished, as if underlining the point that this was the end of the conversation. But he had been so kind already. She could not allow him to make another concession in her favor. Dr. Maturin. I think now we are married, you could risk calling me by my first name, Cicely, he said, still looking at her. Cicely could feel the confusion envelop her face as her mind rewound to the ceremony less than a day ago. Stephen, she began uncertainly. Maturin smiled at her gently, and nodded in confirmation. I expect that you were with your friend Fillings. He continued. Cicely nodded. And I expect you're here to inform me that, as we have a busy day ahead of her, you are off to breakfast now? Cicely nodded again, defeated. I will repay you, she told him silently, if it's the last thing I do. She turned to go, and Maturin looked down at his books. She had taken 2 steps, hand on the door, when he looked back up again. Cicely, if it helps, 4th is far too late to mount to return from berths, even through the officers' quarters. For future reference, I generally rise at the 2nd. 88,888,888. James looked at Cicely with wide eyes in wonder. So my father is alive? Is that truly what old Joe said? Did he mean it? It wasn't one of his stories, was it? Cicely bit into her ship's biscuit lunch and chewed quickly, trying not to think about the weevils that were falling through its substance and landing on the tin plate. He had been overjoyed at the thought of his father aiding her. He chipped in as she described her contact, before recounting the tale old Joe had told him whilst unconscious. From what had described, James had believed he had imagined it all. No, he's right, Jim, said Bondon, sliding next to Cicely and looking at the lad. Joe knew ye father, right enough. And I bet the captain remembers him, too. James grinned up at Wiggin, who was standing next to Bondon. And that's not the best part, she added, smiling at the three lads whose full attention she now had. Cicely had been astonished by their readiness to accept her in her new stead. For the most part she had been treated by and large as Robert Young that morning, Calumet directing her to the Aquila keel, then Blakeney to the mainsail sheet. She had gone to work as she normally would, dressed in her usual clothing, and it had been a full 10 minutes before she realized many of the men were staring at her. Cicely had stopped running the sheet through when she had realized it, and the atmosphere between her comrades and herself was far too much to bear. It had been broken by Blakeney shouting at her to stop her slacking, and then, like German marionettes, the men went back to work. As she'd scrubbed the deck that morning, Cicely had noticed a shadow above her, and had looked into the firm-set face of Joseph Nagel. She had got to her feet, slightly uncertainly, before he held out a grubby hand, saying it was good to see her back. Their section of the deck had been getting far too shabby. A few moments later Killick passed her, gesturing to the floor. "Well done, lad," he'd added, patting her on the back. And that had been that, no ceremony, just acceptance that she was who she'd always been, the lowest-ranking position of Minlad, Robert Young. "Well?" said James, Bondon and Wiggin in unison. "Well, you know how I got on at Sao Paulo?" James nodded. "I had actually tried out for Minlad at the wharf first of all, and it was a fellow by the name of John Fotherington helped me out. Got me back safely to the town. Gave me tips about how I should be. Smart uniform. Who to speak to. When not. Oh, Rob!" he exclaimed, beaming at Bondon and Wiggin. "How wonderful. Thank you for telling me before the battle. He got to his feet and looked out across the sunlit ocean. "That means he's out there somewhere," he added quietly, waiting for me to find him. Bondon turned to Cicely. "Watch it, young. You'll have him crying next." Both men laughed heartily, and Cicely joined them. "When is the captain to attack?" asked Cicely, turning to Wiggin. "I know it's the noon after." She stopped when she noticed Blakeney behind her. Both lads, and James, who had turned from his own private soliloquy, saluted him. Cicely glanced at them, and saluted him also. "Young," said Blakeney. "Lads," he added, extending the conversation to them all. "The battle preparations are to begin. Report now to Lieutenant Pullings in your group order to receive weapons for the battle." "Aye aye, sir," they chorused. Bondon scuttled down towards the mess, while Wiggin and James held fast, waiting for Young. Blakeney looked at them both. "I need to brief Young on proceedings," he said simply. Realization dawned on their faces, and at once Cicely felt herself turning from their comrade to a stranger in their eyes. Both lads saluted and made their way to the mid-deck. Will turned to Cicely. "I think that Dr. Matrin wishes to speak to you before we start," said Blakeney, looking at her and smiling. "Will, I'm fighting," replied Cicely, firmly. "He promised, or else why were we married yesterday?" She leaned against the railings of the ship and looked down. "If here are sins." She sighed, and smiled wanly at Will. "Do you think that's likely?" he added, stepping closer to her and speaking to her softly. "I know he is a man of his word, and dash." "And so is the captain," Cicely interrupted. "And he promised that I was to return to England. How likely is it that Captain Aubrey could persuade the doctor?" Will sighed. "Well, I can come with you if you wish," he added, smiling and taking her hand. Cicely shook it free. "What I wish, Mr. Blakeney, is to be treated as Robert Young. The men treat me as such. They respect my wishes to fight the French. I just wish my superiors would as well." She smiled at Will again, rubbing his shoulder. "It's the only way I can be," she added quietly. "Do you think you could be Cicely for just another 5 minutes?" Will asked, grinning impishly. "I do so prefer it when you're her." She nodded. "Okay, Will, before I go to see the doctor, can you let me in on the plan? What does Robert Young have to do this afternoon?" Will smiled happily, and told her. It went like this: the Minlads, 10 of them including Cicely, were to run the gun cotton to the cannon gunnery officers, having soaked them in oil and tar so as they could be fired easily. Once the ship was close enough to board, most of the able seamen, deckhands and officers would board, tackling the toughest of the enemy. After 20 minutes or so P would blow the bugle, indicating that many of the stronger enemy had been killed and it would be left to them to follow at the rear to finish off the sick and wounded. "And the captain has said I am to take full command of the ship as they fight," he finished proudly. Cicely smiled. To a lad his age and in his position that was indeed a great honor, and she told him so. "Come on," he said, glancing round to make sure Pullings wasn't about to pull him up. "I'll show you your crew deck," and Cicely followed him below to where the gun cotton would be, before trailing after him along the route she would have to take in order to feed the gunnery section. "Cicely," Will said, looking thoughtful. "Why do you want to fight in a battle?" "Why does anyone?" she asked carefully. Will gave her look which said, "You've trusted me before. Trust me again." "I'll be fighting for my country and for my brother," she said. Will nodded, then frowned. "He means why, because I'm a woman, not my motivation," she thought, and changed tack. "Which would you say is more exciting, Will, to fight in a battle or to hear about one after it had happened?" "To fight," he'd replied quickly with excitement. "That's far more fun." "So you would prefer that I missed out on the fun, because I'm a girl?" He shook his head, as he got the point. "But you might get hurt," he added, looking mournful. I'll have you know I was getting hurt falling out of my brother's treehouse before you were even thought of. Cicely pulled Will close and gave him a sisterly hug. You might die, he continued, talking to her tunic. I wouldn't want that, and nor would the doctor. Will looked up, his bright blue eyes shining. Cicely shook her head. That is likely. But I'll be doing what I need to do, and for the captain too. Can you understand that? He nodded, before pulling away, wiping a trickle of moisture from his cheek. Cicely got down to his level and held his hand. I've one more thing to ask, Will. He looked at her earnestly. Don't ever tell the doctor about my true feelings, even if I die. Please. She added, to stop him interrupting. S.H., he said, looking over her shoulder. The doctor's coming. Cicely got to her feet. Ah, said Maturin, looking at them both. I thought I may find you here. I understand the crew is preparing, Mr. Blakeney? Aye, sir, replied Will, saluting the doctor. I was just showing young what he has to do in the battle, sir, seeing as he missed out yesterday. He looked back towards the doctor. If you don't mind, sir, I'll be showing young where to assemble. He took a couple of steps in the direction of the steps towards the upper deck. You adorable child, thought Cicely, making to follow him. How marvelous that at your age you can show such passive resistance to a man nearly 3 times your age when sounding as if you are doing your duty diligently. If I could relieve you of young for just a couple of minutes, I wish to talk to him regarding the battle. Maturin gave Blakeney a look which told the lad he wished to be alone with Cicely. Yes, sir, replied Will, looking apologetically at Cicely for a moment before hurrying up the steps to the mid-deck. Maturin turned to Cicely. You are about to fight in a battle, he said, looking towards Cicely's downward gaze. As am I, he added, brandishing the sword he had in his left hand. Tell me, for the last time, are you prepared for this, to face all the horror that a battle entails? I expect that the reason you are fighting is for the captain, doctor. She saw him raise his eyebrows. Stephen, is because all persons aboard ship are needed in one-to-one combat with the enemy? That every man should do his duty? Maturin looked at her sharply, as if she has just recounted a fact to which she shouldn't be privy. You have told me before that you fight for your brother, you fight for Edward, instead of him. Is that truly necessary? Must you risk your life this day? Cicely looked down, fixing her gaze on a knothole in the plank she was standing on, trying not to scream at him as the rage grew stronger in her very chest. She swallowed. It's as if you don't believe me, she replied, still looking down. You're a man of honor, she thought. Has the captain coerced you? If I didn't believe you, Cicely, I wouldn't have married you. She looked up into his face and saw honesty, kindness, truth. Those qualities amongst the many for which she adored him. Cicely nodded. There is no other way, she confirmed. Then take this, Maturin said, handing Cicely an amber bottle. She glanced into her hand, before quickly trying to press it back into his. I cannot, she said, horrified. If you leave this with me now, I will not take it, and if I am killed today, you will have wasted a good deal of the medicine others who are wounded would need. She looked defiantly at him, until he received it back from her. If that is the case, he said, slipping the vial of laudanum back into his waistcoat pocket, may I take this opportunity to wish you luck? Maturin bent to kiss her, but she stuck out a hand. Thank you, doctor, Cicely said, gripping his hand firmly. Good luck to you as well. 88,888,888. Men of the HMS Surprise. Aubrey addressed them from the quarter-deck, looking down at 6 battalions who would, in the course of the next 3 hours, wage war with the men of the French ship Acheron. My crew. My men. This is a day for which we have waited. This is the day for which we have prepared and toiled. He could see all of their faces now, reflecting the glory of his patriotic words. Jack surveyed his men, all clean as instructed, all primed and ready for battle. The phantom ship, the Acheron, will be within our sights in less than 25 minutes. Including that damned fool Cicely Holm. Cicely Matrin, of course, not Holm now. Against his own better advice, Stephen had married her in order to fulfill her own sense of duty to her brother. The damned fool had stood by his word and allowed her to fight. Even up until this morning he had hoped, though vainly, that Maturin would have convinced her to remain locked in his own cabin until the battle was over. They have declared that they will take us as a prize. Are we going to stand for that? No. Chorused the men, heartily. No. Are we? No. Jack beamed at his men, glancing to his left to Pullings, who pulled his hat in deference. The French ship is bigger and faster than ours with more men. He could hear murmurs of comment from the mid-deck. However, they have one thing we do not have. Jack looked down at Cicely again, who was amongst her peers now. Who had accepted her for being Robert Young, of all things. Let's hope they remember this and do not try anything foolhardy or heroic in her defense. We have surprise on our side. Hut, sir. Hut, sir. Then listen all. We have done our routines. We know our drill. There will be no daring or valiant risks on behalf of anyone. This day we will take Acheron as a prize because God is on our side. God is on our side. Hut, sir. Hut, sir. Hut, sir. 88,888,888. Come on. Yelled James as an enemy cannonball smashed into the top of the hull. We need to get across the now. It was the middle of the afternoon now, and already the battle was in full swing. Aubrey's plan of to hoodwink the ship had gone exactly to plan and had sailed too close. Once this had happened, the captain had put his strategy into action, boarding the vessel first in order to tackle the mightiest of the enemy. All bar the younger gunners and the Millards had boarded with them, and the battle raged strongly on the decks of the French frigate. Come on, Rob, he yelled again, and Cicely ducked as splintered wood flew in her direction. She could see James already on the horizontal rope ladders, held together with grappling irons which the crew had used to cross between the Surprise and the Acheron. Cicely jumped on behind, and began to follow, keeping him in her sights. You can do it. James encouraged, looking back as she looked down at the swirling azure ocean below her, and she gathered all her strength about her in order to catch up with her bear. Before her, she could see, hear and smell the battle, and every so often yells and screams of aggression being meted out permeated her being. Cicely glanced across at the pair fighting now, Killick and what looked like a midshipman, swords meeting together, clashing and clattering like steel pans. She heard a yell in front of her and realized that James had made it across, and had met his first opponent almost at once. Keep going, Cicely told herself. Once you get over there you won't think of it. You'll be with the enemy, fighting. Ahead of her as she crawled the shouts and screams were getting louder. 3/4 of the way there, and she could see the deck of the Acheron. Almost there, she told herself, and, focusing on its oak floor, put her strength about her to pull herself when Cicely saw a man watching her move. Before she knew it, the rope ladder had given away underneath her. It moved pendulously back towards the Surprise. However, Cicely had let go, and thudded against the side of the French ship. Winded, she pushed herself flat against the frame of the hull, and once the nausea began to ebb, she began to inch her hands across it quickly, blocking out the screams and shouts around her so she could concentrate. Behind and to her left, she felt a 9-pounder thud into the Acheron, and heard the men behind its blow inside the ship reel and fall on the inner gunnery side. Wood splintered, and Cicely was showered with flying timber. Move, she told herself urgently, as her hands gripped the outer frame of the gun port above her. Move to the port to your left. Inching her hands along further, her foot kicked the wood of another gun port which, if her feet could be trusted, felt cold, indicating that it was empty. Scrambling inside, Cicely headed to the steps to the upper foredeck, but was forestalled when a huge Frenchman got in her way. He raised a fist and punched her full in the chest. Cicely hit the deck full back, and the man stood over her, his greasy locks hanging over her, and his face showing aggression. Just as he was about to pull Cicely up by the jerkin, another cannonball thundered through the hull, making the man disappear. Cicely scrabbled to her feet, and realized that rather than disappearing, his demise had been hastened by his impact on the supporting beam of the deck, and his head lay 2 feet from the rest of his body. Trying not to think about what had just happened, Cicely hurried herself up the steps to the foredeck. Weaponless now, her only chance was to get a dex and find or steal a blade to continue the fight. Up the steps she went, listening to the more defined sound of battle now, and Cicely could make out more distinctive sounds: blade steel clashing, steel thudding into flesh. Pitiful roars as men met their demise. When she put her head above, what she saw was carnage. Seamen, both French and English, were not engaged in on-to-one combat, were seeking their next engagement, or otherwise strewn dead or dying on the timber. Before her, Calumet was engaged with a lad of his own age, probably a midshipman too. Peter had the upper hand presently, although to Cicely they looked evenly matched. Others too, Bondon, Chell, Nagel. In the chaos and confusion all were striking others of the Acheron. Even Maturin had his sword aloft, fighting for the captain. Cicely looked down, searching the deck now for an available blade, and stepped forward in the direction of a dying Frenchman, a lad not much older than Robert, to retrieve one, straight into a half-dried pool of blood. Cicely stumbled, coming down on her right ankle awkwardly, having just missed a fatal blow. She got to her feet and, cumbersome weapon in hand, struck out clumsily and away from her. He staggered back, having been incapacitated by Wiggin, behind him. He was replaced in her sights by a tall man, far bigger than any she had encountered, who had just brought down Hoole. This time, Cicely took the sword firmly and drove it into his shin. Above the wound the man screamed, and he lunged at Cicely, blade of a Louis XVIII replica heading towards her shoulder. This time, it struck her, but it is an awkward blow, and rather than taking off her arm sliced open the first 3 inches of fabric and grazing her skin, skimming her shoulder from her tunic, so Cicely now had one crumpled sleeve and a top held up by one shoulder. She dodged out of the second blow, and hurtled her way forward. This time she heard the man grunt behind her, and she turned to find he was now dead on the deck, a pool of blood oozing out below him. Without stopping to wonder what had happened, Cicely plunged even deeper into the throng and noticed James stuck between the mainsail mast, defending his life now, and inching ever closer to the floor as the man above him progressed further and further with each attack. Just then, James ducked below the rigging, as the Frenchman's blow struck the mast, and Cicely advanced towards him, rage beginning to throb in her temples. How dare he attack her bare? Serves him right that his blade is now stuck in the mast. Before she could get there though, the man chased off in the direction of James behind the rigging. Cicely followed him round, determined to mete out some revenge for James's close shave. Just as she was about to assault the man, Cicely felt her legs go from underneath her and she was dragged behind the rigging housing. The rage that had filled her chest began to turn into fear as she saw her sword, which she dropped, become further away from her before she was turned over by the assailant and straddled, to prevent her from escaping, his hand clamping her mouth, and as she went to bite the hand that was restraining her, Cicely looked up into an altogether familiar face. Why, if it isn't Mr. Robert Young? John Fotherington smiled broadly when she looked back at him, releasing his grip from her mouth and helping her up. John. Cicely gasped, what are you doing here? Well, it's a pleasure to see you too, Young, he continued, ducking her back behind the wooden housing, after I just saved your neck. Can't hold it against you, mind, seeing as Aubrey saved mine not half an hour ago." Cicely looked back at him in incomprehension. "He just released me from the incarceration this French bathtub had me in, shook me by the hand he did and all." Commande. Without waiting for her to reply, John took her hand and pulled her behind the stern set of steps leading to the quarter-deck. "But Mr. Fotherington," Cicely said, throwing Fotherington a confused look, "I left you in Sao Paulo almost 2 months ago. How did you end up here?" "Well, 's a good question, young. Dunno how I let it happen to myself, actually. I got caught up in some gambling with some men at Sao Paulo when I hadn't been well on me luck. When I lost, they decided, since they couldn't find any actual gold on me, that I would come with them and work on their ship. Great, I thought to myself, get back home in no time and start again. Then when I got there, and I woke up in morning, I was given immunity as a prisoner of war, as long as I told them the secrets I'd been carrying. Which is where I fed 'em a load of bilge water, which sounded like what they wanted to hear. Still never let me go, mind." He looked Cicely up and down. "But even better, and knowing Captain Aubrey's still for me, I'm happy to know you're safe, Robert Young." He clapped her on the back. "What happened, he said, looking at her grazed shoulder. "You should have seen the frog," said Cicely, trying not to think about the mayhem she had insisted she had been a part of. "But never mind me, John. Your son's here." "James," Cicely declared enthusiastically. "James?" The older man looked at her in shock. "He's been looking for you since you left Cadiz." She smiled, trying to smooth the transition of information to Fotherington. "He's really here?" Cicely nodded. "Amazon, like myself." She smiled, but a thought struck her that something wasn't quite right. He was here, captured, yet he had gambled with the French who had taken him as their debt when they found he had no money. Seemed plausible, and yet. "Okay," continued Fotherington, patting her reassuringly on her left shoulder. "I'll find him, which means I'll have to leave you. If you're going to continue this battle, what you need to know is that the French will only get so far before they stop. They'll weigh you up, to see how strong you are. If they can't defeat you, they'll stop, and another Frenchie'll have a go. Takes 'em much longer, but it's a good tactic. Now, we need to get onto the quarter-deck, then I can see where James is. Wait a few moments before going up, then attack the strongest. I'll be behind you and we can bring him round together." Cicely looked into his round face, and nodded before scampering out from under his arm, and up the steps onto the quarter-deck. The first man she sees is the Frenchman who had attacked James 10 minutes ago. He had seemed rather strong, having cowed James into submission before the lad had darted away. She raised her sword and took a swing at the man, missing, and bringing her back round to face the steps. John was quickly ascending now, but James was suddenly beside her. "Cicely!" he screamed, wheeling around to his assailant. "Mon Dieu!" exclaimed the Frenchman, "are you not yet already dead?" Cicely dived forward, trying to trip up the Frenchman, who steps forward and into the path of Fotherington's steps. "John!" screamed Cicely as he leveled his sword not at the Frenchman but at James. "It's James. Your son." Fotherington looked down at her before impaling the Frenchman onto his sword, and turning again to James. Cicely got to her feet and shouted at Fotherington that James was his son. Fotherington turned malevolently towards Cicely, then she realizes what had been bothering her. Fotherington had both legs. He looked in triumph now towards Cicely, pushing James down over the parapet and onto the foredeck. Cicely made to go in his direction, but stopped when John raised his sword to her neck. "Yes, young lady, you noticed the detail. As did I when I saw you. It was very good, he intoned, but one has to be an expert in espionage like myself to fool me. And even then, it would be a close thing." James, she muttered, as he backed her towards the railing that he had just pushed his son over. Your son? No son of mine would willingly slave in the hands of the Royal N, especially not for that fat Bavarian oaf that gracefully straddles the throne of Great Britain. Are your comrades of the HMS Surprise still in the dark about your gender? Or has the doctor already seen evidence of your womanhood? Cicely stopped when she could feel the railing press into her back. Yes. It was such evidence on your clothes that the shopkeeper in Sao Paulo disposed of that confirmed it for me. That and your propriety, and you were too persistent in boarding the Surprise specifically. Yes, I know all about your secret. Holding the sword in his left hand, Fotherington pushed up her tunic and pulled at the bindings with the other, unraveling them with one hand underneath. As he withdrew his hand, Cicely instinctively covered her chest with her hand, until Fotherington pointed the sword tip to her throat. With one swift movement, Cicely thrust her knee towards his groin. Damn, she thought, as she ducked under his right arm, missed. 2 steps later, and Fotherington had backed Cicely against the outer railing of the Acheron, and began to pull at her tunic. She froze as he came closer. She could feel his breath on her neck, hot and acrid. He threw down his sword, laughing. Pretty body like this was made for a fine dress, not shabby mise-en clothes. He moved his hand down her waist. You'll be my prize, for there will be none for the secrets I have shed here. Fotherington moved his left hand down onto her thigh, working his way up to the waistband of her breeches. He brought it to rest on her backside and began to pull at the fabric, as he breathed heavily into her face. Closing her eyes, Cicely reached down to his right hand and took the flesh between her thumb and fingers, twisting it until he screamed. He slapped her across the deck, nursing his hand. Whore! He screamed at her. I will have you. Cicely watched as he took a pistol from his pocket, but instead of leveling at her, turned to the bow of the ship. She got to her feet, and looked in the direction of his shot. He was aiming at Aubrey. No. She screamed in horror. Why? You were his comrade. The men still speak of your heroic deeds. You saved the ship at Gibraltar. Whatever gave you that idea? Old Joe? Fotherington snarled, turning to look at her with disdain. Yes, he knew me. Before I found the pay was somewhat healthier coming from the coffers of Bonaparte. Espionage has been my game for a long time now, not least because they are not Protestant heretics. Cicely gasped in horror as Fotherington cocked the pistol, and repositioned his shot in the captain's direction. No. She screamed, moving in front of him. How could you? He was your captain. And he's your son, Cicely added, pointing where James lay unconscious on the foredeck. Once I rid Aubrey of that despicable habit called living, I will be the wealthiest man in the New World, said Fotherington slowly. The war won't trouble me there, and I can live out my days in peace. No. Screamed Cicely again as Fotherington squeezed the trigger. She kicked his hand holding the gun. The bullet's trajectory jerked with the force. And Chell fell dead from the crow's nest. Ah! Fotherington roared in anger. You baggage! I only had one shot. He threw Cicely onto the deck before grabbing her by what material was left of her tunic in his right hand, pulling her eye level. How dare you interfere with my affairs? Cicely kicked out towards the man, and tried to unpeel his hands from her. He tightened his grip so most of the material was round her throat. There's not just me. He is sought by many of the good men of Napoleon. Others will try. And next time you will not be in the position to interfere. Taking 3 steps towards the edge of the ship, John Fotherington held Cicely over the edge. Below her, swirling waves of tempestuous ocean beat against the hull. Around her, though the battle still raged, gunners on the opposite side still firing and men still dying, Cicely could feel the breath being squeezed out of her as he held her by one hand over the turbulence. Others will try, She heard him say again, and she fixed him with a stare into his mad eyes. There was a single gunshot behind him. Stephen Maitrin shot a single bullet through the back of Fotherington's head. As Cicely fell backwards, so did Fotherington, his eyes unfocused and delirious. She felt him fall on her as they tumbled over, the man falling on top of her as they plunged into the debris of the Acheron. Cicely felt her head meet timber as she was pushed further and further down beneath the sea. She tried to swim from underneath him, but the lack of air in her lungs made her flounder as the light above her grew rapidly fainter as the seconds passed. Images of her brother drowning filled her mind as she closed her eyes and gave way to unconsciousness.